Thanks, Sarah. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay.
Yep.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Pat Bradshaw. I'm a risk manager for a specialist risk practice called Optimise, based out of the northwest of England. In case you couldn't already tell with my accent, sounding like an extra out of Coronation Street. Um, that reference might fall on deaf ears, actually, for those that aren't from the UK. Very flattered to be asked by my friend Sarah to contribute to today's discussion. As those of you who know will appreciate, she left my brief deliberately ambiguous, which meant I had to think quite carefully about what I actually wanted to discuss, which I thought would be useful to share. As a risk manager, obviously, I spend a lot of time operating in the may or may not, the uncertain space. So it might come as a little bit of a surprise that what I want to talk about, what I want to talk about today, which is the opposite of that, which is certainty. And of course, the two are obviously inextricably linked. They often get conflated. And I feel like that's where some of the biggest issues in infrastructure projects start to emerge. So, what I wanted to do today was explore a few areas where I feel they blur the line between where the line is blurred between certainty and uncertainty, what that looks like in practice, what we can do about it, and ultimately the impact that that may or may not have on how effectively infrastructure projects are delivered. As mentioned, I'll try and keep this relatively high level and hopefully just give you all a few useful reflections to take away. In the context of raw materials, I'd be lying if I said I had even a hair's experience of some of the amazing panelists, or all the amazing panelists have. However, I'd like to think that some of the themes that I'm discussing today will be applicable in any context. Also, would like to caveat that I am particularly passionate about the natural world. And one of the great advantages of my role in infrastructure projects is using it, hopefully, to make the world a better place. Let me get to the next slide. So that's my lid in the middle, obviously. Bit of an agenda, so just a very brief journey today. I won't make it War and Peace, don't worry. A bit of an intro into the topic, the soundbite of today's session, which is the illusion of certainty in projects. Some of the points of the psychology of why I feel that may or may not be the case. Some areas where I feel like uncertainty and certainty get conflated. QRA, where I spend a huge amount of my role where I've spent a huge amount of my time in the past 5 years, and sort of discussing insights versus illusion. Known but not acted on. So again, I'll go into a bit more detail on that in a moment. And lastly, reframing certainty. So just giving some sort of final thoughts. So a bit of a journey today. Again, I'll keep this high level. Hope everyone's impressed. This slide took me longer than the rest of the presentation. I was showing off to my wife yesterday, and she was bored by it. So hopefully you find it more interesting. So I graduated in 2015. I did law at university. Didn't want to be a lawyer. It just so happened that that degree seemed to suit my skill set when I was at school. When I graduated from uni, I did not want to go straight into work or further education. So I did the adult thing. I went traveling for a couple of years. Spent about 18 months in Australia where I did all manner of jobs, which I'll touch on in a moment, what I think is relevant. I did call centres in Sydney. I was speaking to people about charity on the streets in Sydney. I worked on a building site. I delivered the Yellow Pages in Perth. I worked on farms in Queensland, did removals in Brisbane, basically anything to prevent me from coming home. Also did about 5 months traveling, 6 months traveling across 5 different countries in Southeast Asia. When I got back, I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do. So just by chance, I happened to meet somebody who worked in recruitment, and they felt that my skill set, from my personality, relatively extroverted, as well as some of the stuff that I'd done in Australia, sort of lent itself to that. Spent 3 years doing that, which was incredibly tough. I know the industry does get a bit of slack, and from my experience, I worked for a company that deserved the slack, and I worked for one that didn't. But I don't regret a thing. I think it teed me up excellently well into hitting the ground running a career in risk management, which happened by chance, which I'm sure most people that you speak to in risk will agree that is the case. Nobody grows up saying I want to be a risk manager when I grow up, but it's the best thing that ever happened to me. My flatmate at the time, I'd just recently been made redundant at the start of the pandemic, and my flatmate at the time was still worked in recruitment. He said, "I've got an assistant risk practitioner role across my desk. Do you fancy it?" So yeah, why not? Um, Nextly, just very, very quickly, in terms of my journey to date from a risk perspective. So, early tenure in my career, I spent some time doing some work in the aviation sector, moved on into a QRA only function in the highways projects. From there, I spent the greatest proportion of my career in the rail industry, where I worked with some fantastically talented risk and project professionals, which I owe a huge amount to. From there, I spent some time in nuclear projects, sort of highly regulated industries, which moved me on to my sort of the commission I'm in at the moment, which I'm enjoying thoroughly, which is in the Great Grid Upgrade for National Grid. So a bit of an intro. So this session, I'll be exploring how projects create a sense of certainty through planning, analysis, and governance, and how that can sometimes actually mask underlying uncertainty. I'll share several observations of my own experience working in these major infrastructure projects, particularly in the risk context, obviously. And just a caveat, these aren't definitive conclusions. These are just reflections on patterns and trends that I've noticed. So I'd very much like to be challenged on those if anybody disagrees with anything I've said, or likewise if anyone does agree and sort of any thoughts and feelings that they've got off the back of that. Cool. So the illusion of certainty in projects then, so it sounds like a bit of a soundbite, but bear with me. So when we talk about projects, we tend to focus a lot on uncertainty and how to reduce it, eliminate it. But in my experience, uncertainty isn't always the real problem. The problem is how we actually respond to it. And we often replace uncertainty with something which feels a great deal more comfortable, which is actually certainty. However, oftentimes that certainty isn't actually real, it's constructed. So what I mean by that is programs, they're built with precision, milestones are dialed in, costs are locked in, which creates the illusion of control. But more often than not, the assumptions that have been used to underpin those decisions can oftentimes be immature or just not quite fully understood. So in theory, on paper, everything works, everything's understood in inverted commas, but in practice, things can rarely pan out that way. So what I wanted to talk about today isn't how we remove uncertainty, which might sound strange coming from a risk manager, but it's how we stop pretending that we already have. So just a bit of a segue, I don't think it's any real secret that infrastructure projects, particularly in the UK, don't have the best track record when it comes to meeting baseline and in terms of time and cost certainty. And if you've worked in that space, it's those ones that have sort of spiraled out of control, derailed, which are the ones which will leave a lasting taste in the mouth. And so I feel like it's very natural to want to respond to that by trying to take control. So we're fixing the scope, we're fixing the cost, we're fixing the program. On the face of it, we've got a really firm grip on everything. But in reality, that can sometimes and oftentimes do more harm than good. And absolutely, I'm not tone deaf. I understand that the leadership team need confidence and stakeholders need reassurance. But when we create a fixed plan too early, any deviation from it can feel more significant, not necessarily because we can't react to it or it can't be managed, but just because it feels a lot more unexpected. I've alluded to the psychology of certainty here, but I probably should have said the psychology of avoidance, because what I'm referring to here are some of the reasons I feel people are naturally inclined to avoid things that are particularly scary or even harmful, and then will potentially anchor to something which feels a little bit safer. So ambiguity, obviously it feels threatening, it's uncomfortable, uncertainty is uncomfortable, so we tend to default what feels known, even if it's based on optimistic or even incomplete assumptions. Identity is tied to control, so acknowledging risk can actually feel like we're out of control or we have a lack of control. So uncertainty is sometimes softened or even delayed rather than confronted head on. Avoiding conflict, I think that's just a natural human behavior. Challenging assumptions can sometimes create tension, so it's often easier to align to the plan and then deal with those issues later, essentially kicking the can down the road. Successes increase pressure, so the bigger the project, the greater the pressure to appear confident and in control, which makes honest conversations around uncertainty and indeed certainty may be a little bit more difficult. And lastly, no shared playbook. So large infrastructure projects will always bring multiple teams together, but I feel from my experience, there's rarely a consistent approach to aligning assumptions and challenging collectively what I like to call the golden thread. Excuse me. So again, just thinking out loud. So in terms of what I'm going at here. So not uncertainty, certainty. So this idea actually was born from an article which I read recently, which basically suggested that the consistently poor track record of infrastructure delivery in this country is largely driven by sort of self-imposed red tape and regulatory complexity. And the argument was basically that these projects are are in national interest to deliver on time and to budget. And yet it's the very systems designed to protect that interest which are ultimately slowing them down and even driving schedule and cost overruns. And I was really reflecting on that, and it got me thinking about whether or not I agreed with it, because in reality, I don't think that these are risks in the way that we often frame them. So things, as you can see on the screen, like planning permissions, ecology considerations, stakeholder engagements, things like that, they aren't particularly unknown. They're not volatile. They're not unpredictable. They're well established. They're repeatable. They're largely well understood constraints, not particularly novel. Now, I do also acknowledge that there will be emerging policies and regulatory changes that do genuinely introduce uncertainty, but that's not what I'm referring to here. Here I'm referring to the constraints that are consistently present across the projects, regardless of the sector or scale. So for me, the challenge isn't that these things are too onerous or too uncertain. The challenge is that we often fail to fully account for them from the outset, or at least that's what I've seen in my experience. So my challenge often on projects is that these aren't actually risks, they are just conditions of delivery, which just aren't very well prepared for. So again, I don't feel like we're necessarily dealing with uncertainty. Again, I caveat that there will be some emerging policies and procedures which do sort of fit that narrative. But yeah, I feel like we aren't dealing with uncertainty specifically. We're misclassifying certainty and ultimately how it's treated. So as I mentioned, across all industries, regardless of the scope and the context, there will always be sort of onerous regulatory processes which we need to abide by. And in my case in particular, I've noticed that these have been the biggest risks on the register, the big juicy red risks. And my challenge would be to think of them not as risks to manage later, but certainties that should define the baseline from day one. And I appreciate that that might sound obvious, and there might be people listening and hearing this thinking we already do that. But in reality, it doesn't always show up that way in delivery, from my personal experience. QRA. So, for those of you that aren't aware, QRA stands for Quantitative Risk Analysis. It's something that I've spent a lot of time and effort in the past sort of 5 or 6 years of my career, and so naturally, it was one of my key reflections when I was thinking about illusion of certainty in projects. So, just a caveat, QRA is obviously an extremely powerful tool when it's used properly and where it challenges our thinking rather than just confirming it, which is obviously really important. And again, just to be clear, this isn't a criticism of the tool or anybody using it. At its best, it helps us really understand uncertainty, identify key drivers, which is really important, and also helps to support better decision making. But in practice, what can sometimes happen is we take uncertain inputs, like assumptions that aren't fully understood, like I mentioned earlier, and risks that aren't always very well defined, and run them through a model. And what comes out is a number, and that number very quickly becomes the answer in inverted commas. And that's where the illusion can sometimes start. Sometimes QRA doesn't challenge the plan per se, it actually legitimizes it. And we stop challenging it, the outputs that is, in the same way that we would challenge the inputs. There's something which, as you can see on screen, it's garbage in, garbage out. You're only as good as the inputs, and also garbage in, gospel out, which for me is very, very topical, because oftentimes it can feel, just because we've put suboptimal inputs through some form of quantitative analysis, some science, which has got bells and whistles, oh, it must make sense, it must be gospel, when of course that's absolutely not the case. Something else that I've seen quite regularly, which is answer shopping, which is rerunning the model to get a more palatable outcome. And again, I absolutely say that that is different to reviewing an iteration of a model and sort of understanding, does it pass the giggle test? Maybe it's not giving the answer that we quite expected, not because it's not palatable, but because maybe something's not quite interfacing the models we expected. Two very, very different things. That's not what I'm talking about here. or misinterpreting the output. So take, for example, P50, sometimes we can say, oh, that's the most likely, or it's the mean, or the P80 is treated as the safe option. So however, rather than just saying QRA creates the illusion of certainty, I'd like to reframe it to suggest that it can either reinforce false certainty, or actively challenge it. So a couple of key recommendations here off the back of sort of QRA, and this is for the benefit of people who maybe on the call who are actually responsible for running risk analyses, or it's just for the benefit of people who are the recipients of the outputs. So number one, challenge inputs harder than the outputs. Most of the scrutiny, from my experience, particularly from the SLT, senior leadership team, tends to happen once the outputs are developed. But the real value sits in challenging the inputs, the correlations and the logics in the first instance. If you can't defend the inputs, then don't trust the outputs. And a risk model doesn't necessarily fix poor understanding. As I mentioned, that garbage in, gospel out, it amplifies it. Number two, present ranges, not points. So the moment you present a single number, people anchor to that. Even if you explain distributions, they'll remember one date, one cost, one answer. And oftentimes when you provide a report, even with that caveat, it will make its way through multiple layers of the P3 environment. And oftentimes the detail gets stripped out to more and more high-level information. So if your team benchmarks against a particular percentile, for example, let's say P50, show them the curtain between P0 and P50 and hold that mirror up. This means that you're comfortable with the project finishing somewhere between here and here. Differentiate between certainty and uncertainty. So if everything is certain, nothing is understood. Expose weak assumptions in challenging, and also the so what, focus on the drivers, not just the output. So what all this really comes back to is QRA doesn't create certainty, but if we're not careful, it can make uncertainty actually feel certain, and that can be where illusion starts. Conscious of time, so last couple of slides, sorry, Sarah. So known but not acted on. So again, something very, very topical, which hopefully people can, whether or not you're a risk practitioner or not, can go away with this information and try and use it to the best of your ability. So a lot of organizations or projects that I've worked on, and I include myself in this, can sometimes fall into what I would describe as risk accounting. And to be clear, that's not because people are bad at the jobs. In fact, it sometimes applies to some of the best risk managers of the industry. But what project teams are particularly good at is identifying risk, quantifying them, capturing them, discussing them, documenting them. And oftentimes you're sort of drawn to abide by arbitrary health metrics. They're not, okay, arbitrary is probably a little bit harsh. I think health metrics are important, but they're not the be all and end all. And that oftentimes can be where it stops, and ultimately where the value stops. The risks aren't meaningfully acted on. They don't change any behaviors. They don't reshape the program. They don't materially influence decisions. They sit in registers and they're reported on, but they don't integrate into how the project's actually being delivered. And again, this is another way in how that illusion of certainty is maintained, because on paper, it looks like we've addressed the risk, we mistake capturing it for managing it, and that's how the illusion of certainty is created. So moral of the story is, even the best risk management processes won't add the intended value if they don't influence behaviors and decision making. So very final slide then, just to leave a couple of key thoughts. Certainty doesn't always equal removing uncertainty. Certainty for me comes from being honest and understanding. Precision doesn't always equal accuracy. Just because something looks precise, it doesn't mean it's correct. The difference between and converting certainty to resilience. So the difference between certainty and resilience for me is assuming things go well, and one is being prepared when they don't. Leveraging uncertainty to your advantage, it's absolutely fine. In fact, it's optimal to say, I don't know. Like I say, it's in fact probably the most honest and open way to start. If I was to ask people on this call, how long does it take you to drive to your local shop? You'd probably be able to give me a very precise answer. You've done it before, you understand the route, variability is low, there's a level of certainty there. However, if I was to ask you how long it would take you to drive to Vienna, the answer would naturally be very different. You'd start thinking in ranges, you'd challenge assumptions, you'd consider variables, traffic, route choice, stops, even things things you can't be specific about. So the goal isn't to be certain, it's to be prepared. And then lastly, so we often talk about certainty as if it's something that we need to achieve. But for me, certainty, as I've already alluded to, doesn't come from removing uncertainty. It comes from it comes from understanding it and planning for it properly. And the goal isn't to eliminate it; it's to use it. Sorry, it isn't to eliminate uncertainty; it's to use it. It's to surface it early. It's to challenge it properly, and it's to build plans that reflect in reality how projects actually behave. Because ultimately, the projects that succeed aren't the ones that pretend uncertainty doesn't exist. They're the ones that are built to handle it. And I'll just leave you all with a little mic drop moment that certainty for me isn't about being right; it's about being ready.
Beautiful. What a good way to finish it, Pat. Round of applause. Fantastic. Absolutely brilliant. Um, I think what's really interesting is hearing, what you've been saying, and then also what Edith was saying as well around, these tools, they don't make something less certain, kind of more certain, but they do help you to organize all of that. If we know all this stuff, why aren't we doing it?
Uh, it's a very, very good question. I feel like, again, I feel like from a certainty perspective, it's about being honest and it's about being prepared. And like I say, from my personal experience working in projects, particularly from the outset, I'm not tone deaf to neglect the fact that leadership team need confidence, stakeholders need assurance, and we need some level of understanding about what it is we're trying to achieve. And it's come down to that old adage that fail to plan, plan to fail. So I'm absolutely not advocating that that shouldn't be the case. I think what I'm advocating is just being honest um, in our shortfalls, particularly when you're working in environments like if you're in an option E, for example, where the clarity of the scope is extremely uncertain. Even when you're working in fixed price contracts, you might have delivered the scope 100 times, but I still feel like behaviourally there's elements, like I say, around really on the project I'm on at the moment. It was around ecology and around planning permissions, and it's a conversation that I'm having with the project team consistently. Is like this isn't a particularly, even though it's the scope isn't hasn't been delivered to this scale before. It's not the way that we consent projects and the way that we interact with the environment for me isn't unique. It's been that way since time immemorial. So I think the reason that we don't do it is still because of that anchoring to certainty, because we'll see whether or not it's conscious or subconscious. The goalpost gets set early doors, and there's very little flexibility in how we approach that as we move forward. So sorry, I've gone a little bit off piece there, Sarah. So I think the reason we don't do it is because seemingly we just don't take certainty seriously enough.
And perhaps in the sort of deepest, darkest parts of our souls, we really want the project to happen or something like that as well. So brilliant. Again, Pat, so much more that we could talk about, but absolutely brilliant. Everyone, please put your hands together for the fabulous Pat Bradshaw. Thank you very much, mate.
My
Fantastic.
pleasure. Thank you.
Great.